This is topic 4, Political and Economic Change by Will Brown, Joe Bardo, and Clay Crawford. So there are 3 types of change: reform, revolution, and coup d'etat. So reform is the type of change that doesn't advocate for the overthrow of basic institutions. Reformers generally want to change some of the methods that political and economic leaders use to reach socially acceptable goals. Revolution is obviously a lot more extreme. It involves either a major revision or an overthrow of existing institutions, and they usually affect more than one area of life. And the final one, coup d'etat, represents the most limited type of change, and it's even more extreme than revolution. It replaces the leadership of a country with new leaders. They generally occur in countries where government institutions are already weak and leaders have taken control by force. Most of the time, they're carried out by the military, and a lot of times are also under threat from another faction. There are 4 different attitudes: radicalism, liberalism, conservatism, and reactionary beliefs. So radicalism is the belief that rapid, dramatic changes need to be made in the existing society, including the political system. Radicals usually think that the current system cannot be saved and must be replaced. And for example, within our own country, liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism supports reform and gradual change rather than radicalism. And liberals don't generally believe that a country's systems are broken. They believe that gradual change is the best. And then conservatism is a lot less supportive of change than radicalism or liberalism. They consider the state and or regime to be important sources of law and order that would be jeopardized by change. And finally, reactionary beliefs, they go further than conservative beliefs to oppose change. However, they are different because reactionaries find the existing status quo unacceptable. They want to reinstate institutions that already existed and will use violence to carry that out. And finally, there are 3 different types of trends: democratization, movement towards market economies, and the revival of ethnic or cultural politics. More nations are turning toward some popular form of government, essential characteristic being regular competitive elections, which is an example of which is what democratization is. And then a market economy allows private individuals to own businesses and industries, in contrast with the command economy, in which the government owns and controls the businesses and industries. And then finally, in many places, the revival of important cultural aspects has become very common. For example, in the Middle East, political terrorism is committed in the name of Islam under the institution of jihad.
All right. So what does democracy really mean? So we often hear the term democracy. We think the United States and other countries are democracies, but maybe we don't really have a great understanding for what it really is. So there are a couple of elements here that I kind of listed of what a democracy is. So free elections, civil liberties, meaning freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, stuff like that. Equal rule under the law. So, if you're a noble, you're not, you don't have an exception to the law. Checks on the abuse of power. So for instance, the checks and balances system that we have in the United States. An open civil society, and of course, civilian control of the military. So great examples of this. The United States is kind of a great example of a democracy. We obviously know a lot about it, but we have equal rule of law. It's kind of a huge tenet of our democracy, civil liberties, free elections. And so all of these kind of combine to create a what is really a substantive democracy in the United States. And kind of a con to that is Russia, where they're kind of actually receding away from democracy and sort of what they had in the 90s, where, not everyone's equal under the law. They don't really have an open civil society. There is no real civilian control of the military, right? Vladimir Putin has total control of the military. So they're kind of the opposite of that. Something that I found interesting is there's never been a truly substantive democracy, meaning that you can get close to being a substantive democracy, but to actually have, total mastery of all these tenets has really never been done. Illiberal democracies are basically democracies that are maybe have 1 or 2 of these tenets. They're kind of like Russia, but they haven't gone all the way to being a substantive democracy. And then the snowball effect is the idea that when one democracy occurs, others in that, close geopolitical region are more likely to become democracies. So next slide. So why does this occur, and what are Huntington's waves? So I think the best way I can really describe this is like the ancient idea of the Chinese dynasties falling. So Chinese dynasties would fall for a variety of reasons, but mostly for external, internal threats or from like a natural disaster. And so that kind of leads into the next point, which is like trigger events. So a trigger event is an event that would cause a country to become a democracy, maybe a famine or terrible human rights abuses. So stuff like that would then create a trigger event and kind of revolutionary fervor to create a democracy. Revolutions of rising expectations are the idea where you've got maybe the stock market and the standard of living is going up, and then all of a sudden it starts to tank, and that could then cause a trigger event. And democratic consolidation is the idea that the military, the ruling elites, and the population all cooperate and they all want a democracy. And if one or more don't, it's very hard for a democracy to happen. Political liberalization, Will kind of touched on this, but is the idea of a country moving towards a democracy. Another idea that would create or make a democracy more likely is the loss of legitimacy by left and right-wing groups. You've kind of seen that in the United States kind of right now. The expansion of the urban middle class, and I already mentioned, but a new emphasis on human rights, the rights that all individuals have. So something that historians often argue over is there a correlation between liberalism and market economies? And I can best describe this through like Mexico versus China. So in Mexico, you have a democracy and they've slowly been moving towards a democracy and they have a market economy. But then in China, they have a market economy, or what most people would describe as a market economy, and yet they're definitely not going to a democracy. And so these two things, there's kind of polar opposite examples of, do these cause each other? What's the causation behind them? That kind of thing. Or is there a correlation? And then Huntington's waves, just briefly. So the first wave occurred gradually over time. The second wave is like World War World War II, like after we won that, to like the 1970s. And then the next wave is 1970s on, where totalitarian rulers are falling, basically just democratic fervor that you kind of see now. And the theoretic foundation for it basically came out of early 1800s and 1700s European countries, where the middle class and the elites, they wanted economic freedom, but they also wanted to be represented politically. So the next slide is just kind of a brief way that I thought was kind of easy to summarize all these different terms. So the first one, you see the soldier and all the people and Mr. Monopoly, and that's democratic consolidation. So you've got the elites and the common people and the military all on board to have a democracy. You've got what looks like that equal sign up there, which is actually the symbol for human rights, basically. Then, which is another huge part of that. I put some dead crops on the left, which is kind of a trigger event, maybe a famine. The stock market thing that's falling, the revolution of rising expectations. So, people are dissatisfied with their well-being, and then the right and left-wing groups on the right kind of losing their ability to be respected. And that kind of all factors into whether a democracy happens or not.
Yeah, so I'm pretty much just gonna expand on what Will was saying about the economies and the differences in the different kind of economies in the world. So a command economy, as a lot of us know, the government owns industrial enterprise and means production. It's usually dominated by party systems, one party system, typically one that all has a unifying viewpoint on the world. And that creates the blueprint for the rest of the population. There's not too much freedom. You kind of are told what to do by the party at hand or the power and rule. And a lot of the issues with that industrial growth, the industrial growth did happen because as you're told what to do, you have to meet certain quotas and do certain things of that such. As example, in the USSR, but it did not lead to higher standards of living. And that was a big issue in a lot of people's eyes, that their standard of living was not going up, even though the industrial growth of the country was going up. And that made a big switch in a lot of people's eyes to market economies and its popularity going up. And a lot of people believed that government was too big. They had too much of a role in the say of what people were doing with their lives, their businesses, their livelihoods, and the lack of successes in command economies. The collapse of the USSR was a big one, and it kind of switched the mood in a lot of places to market economy, which is where the means of production and prices are created based on the competitors in the field. It's more of a free enterprise. People aren't telling you what to do as much. They're independently run, free of government rule, and they're privately organized based on what kind of businesses you want to run, and the prices are created by the consumer, not the government. So it's kind of like supply and demand, and market economies have become the choice for many successful nations across the world, one being the United States of America, which has been very successful. Marketization is the state's reaction of a market in which property, labor, goods, and services can all function in a competitive environment to determine their value. Privatization in that field is the transfer of state-owned property, which would be a little bit more of a command economy, into private ownership, which would be more of a free market. And in that process, depressions, economic downturns, and ebbs and flows will occur in those markets of privatization. And economies will go on a downturn, but they will also come back up. As a great example is the Great Depression. The stock market went really high up, then it kind of took a deep turn, but eventually over time it came back up. And the marketization is when the government starts to believe power belongs in their hands, partially due to the economy going down and like on a downturn, such as the Great Depression. And they create a mixed economy where there's some free enterprise, but sometimes they're telling you what to do. And it doesn't work for the revamp of the enterprise system. After the Great Depression, it kind of went a little bit up and kind of stagnant. And then as more free enterprise happened and mixed economy went away, they were able to fix those problems. And down below, less government, free enterprise led to the Great Depression, but it also leads over time back up. The economy fixes itself. And yeah, next slide. And then the revival of ethnic and cultural politics, as Will was talking about in his slide. Fragmentation is division based on ethnic or cultural identity. A great example of that in the politicalization of religion is the separation of church and state in the United States, and political terrorism in the Middle East, which is carried out in the name of Islam, and as Will touched on, the jihad. And future conflicts and challenges between civilizations that happens. It shows a lot of differences. It shows that there are a lot of differences in each nation, and people have different viewpoints, and it sometimes can push us away from the commonalities that everybody has. And they're going to happen one way or another, but the way that we deal with them is really, really important, and just see everybody's side. So it's kind of all I got.
I think we're done. You're right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.